At the outset of World War II, the British sent an expeditionary force into Belgium to help the French push back the invading German armies. But Germany was too strong. With hundreds of thousands of English troops surrounded at the town of Dunkirk, a massive evacuation was planned. It was an impossible task, but amidst the tragedy of loss, there was also the miracle at Dunkirk. This is where the British took their first major stand against the Germans, on the battlefront. On September 1st, 1939, 112 divisions of the German army roll into Poland. By May 1940, Hitler orders the implementation of Plan Yellow for the invasion of Holland, Belgium, and France. "136 divisions are committed to bring the French to their knees." Adolf Hitler then plans to cross the Channel to England. He is confident he can defeat the armies of the Low Countries. But a British expeditionary force of 250,000 men has been sent to defend France and can pose stiff opposition.
The British Expeditionary Force was, in contemporary parlance, a strike force. It was the sum total of the forces Britain could put into the field in Europe. It moved from Britain to France soon after the declaration of war in September 1939, and by May 1940, it was actually the most powerful army on the Allied side.
The German plan is a two-pronged attack to seal off the French First Army, the British Expeditionary Force, and the Belgian Army.
Well, the Germans had been riding high. Everything had gone their way. They were convinced that the war would be over quickly, that they were going to defeat the British, and that the war would be over and they'd be home by fall. Everything had gone so well in the spring of 1944. They had very few casualties, and they were completely high on the glory of winning. The Dutch, being a very small nation with no sizable military force, the Belgians the same way, there was no chance that the Germans would be stopped by the Dutch or the Belgians.
The Germans handily defeat the Belgian army with military superiority and strength.
When the Germans opened the offensive in the West, the British Expeditionary Force moved into Belgium as part of what was called the Dial Plan. They were expecting that the major German move would come through Belgium, past Brussels, the way it had in 1914. Civilians were glad to see them, showed they were not alone, but there were already disconcerting signs. There were crowds of refugees already taking shape on the road, Belgians fleeing German air attacks.
With their light movable army, the British take up positions quickly.
As the British moved into Belgium, was some days before they met the German army. What they did encounter was first the German Air Force. There were initial attacks on British positions.
On May 14th, 4 days after the invasion, General Erwin Rommel orders his 7th Panzer Division, known as the Ghost Division, across the Meuse River.
This was the spearhead of the German advance towards Dunkirk. It was called the Ghost Division because it moved so fast the French High Command could not keep track of its location.
Only 1 day later, German troops marched victoriously into Holland. Rommel is now convinced the way to the west is open.
The British morale endured despite the repeated defeats of the French army. This was a strong force, a lot of pre-war regulars, and had a great deal of confidence in itself and its leaders.
Because of the weakness of the other armies, the British forces begin to fall back toward the coastal towns. The Germans have been able to break through French defenses and create a dangerous 50-mile gap in the lines. The Germans are on their way to yet another conquest.
Obviously, they felt extremely confident. There was nothing to hold them. There was no opposition virtually to their movements. And at that time, of course, the Luftwaffe still could provide air cover, so that the Germans were extremely optimistic and convinced that the war was going to be over. They were going to win it easily.
Just 10 days after the invasion, the Germans have pushed all opposition to the sea.
They had defeated whatever resistance there was. They had destroyed the French resistance in a very short time. The British were running. There was no reason for them not to be ecstatic.
But the soldiers of both the retreating and advancing armies are not the only ones on the move.
Germans had opened their offensive in the west with massive air attacks, creating loads of refugees, which impeded British and French troop movement. In some places, the people had had their houses destroyed in the First World War and were just horrified that it was all going to happen again. Most of the British Army retreated on Dunkirk in good order and was intended to have won many of the battles they encountered with the German army as they retreated.
With the British surrounded at Boulogne and Calais, Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal von Rundstedt orders his panzers to a halt because of the loss of too many tanks in the advance. After 2 weeks of hard battle, German soldiers take advantage of the time off to tend to personal luxuries and some frivolity. But it all ends too soon. As the countryside becomes a battleground, civilians continue their flight. With the Germans closing in from both east and west, and with the ocean behind them, the British consider a last resort: a full evacuation from Dunkirk.
Some individuals cut off from their units came back and were helped out by French civilians. Many made their way to Dunkirk if they had been cut off during the retreat in disguise. By and large, the British Expeditionary Force fell back towards Dunkirk in good order.
When the Germans learn of the evacuation plan, von Rundstedt orders his panzers back into battle and launches the biggest attack of the campaign. But the respite has allowed the Allies the opportunity to mount a ring of artillery around the besieged army. The Germans can no longer break through easily. With all the British troops moving towards Dunkirk, the question remains, how will 340,000 of them be evacuated? May 27th, 1940. With the Germans closing in from both sides, the bulk of the British force and part of the French First Army escapes through the middle of the enemy divisions into the area around Dunkirk.
Fortunately for the British, the terrain around Dunkirk is very good for defense. There are canals which they could set up defensive positions behind and prove formidable obstacles to German tanks.
The only weapons the British have at Dunkirk are small arms and World War I vintage machine guns. There's a noticeable shortage of any heavy artillery.
One of the great losses were once they got to Dunkirk, all the vehicles, artillery pieces had to be destroyed. Many of the trucks were driven into the English Channel, using to build up makeshift docks to bring boats alongside when the evacuation started.
While a delaying action is waged in the south at the port of Calais to prevent the Germans from driving up the coast, the battle to hold Dunkirk rages furiously. The fight moves from street to street and house to house. The battle for Dunkirk has been reduced to the bare minimum. There are no large armies facing each other, just small groups of desperate, trapped men. May 28th. With German tanks within sight of Dunkirk, von Rundstedt orders his panzers out for good and heads them south to Paris.
The German commanders were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe that they had been told to halt. They felt that they could have wiped out the British Army right there. We now know that Hitler probably didn't want to destroy the British Army at that point because he still, in 1940, had visions of a German-English alliance against Russia.
But there are still nearly 350,000 men at Dunkirk to be evacuated. The rescue plan, called Operation Dynamo, has many obstacles. English ships must face minefields, German U-boats, and Luftwaffe fighters as they cross the channel. If they make it through, there are still the enemy guns at Calais. Once within reach of Dunkirk, the big ships discover they are too big for the port's shallow waters. They can't get in close enough to evacuate the men. Only 7,000 make it out the first day in rescue boats, just 2%. On the 29th, the ships use a new coastal approach to Dunkirk. They escape the Calais shelling, but instead they're bombed and strafed by the Luftwaffe. "47,000 troops now make it out safely. By late afternoon on the 29th, all rescue teams are alerted. Dunkirk harbor is now blocked by damaged ships. Any further evacuations must be conducted from the beaches. In this one day alone, 3 destroyers have been sunk, 6 badly damaged. The Admiralty, alarmed by the loss, suddenly orders all new class destroyers withdrawn. Without them, the evacuation is in trouble. Although the Panzer divisions have withdrawn, units of German soldiers continue to harass the town of Dunkirk. On the morning of May 30th, an urgent telephone call goes to the British War Ministry. Commanders report that the perimeter defense cannot be held for long. They need as many boats and as much ammunition as possible. All of the British Expeditionary Force and the remnants of the French First Army have now congregated onto a corner of beach 24 miles long and 6 miles wide. From across the Channel, the strangest fleet in naval history begins to materialize. From the luxury yachts of the wealthy to the grimy working tugs of London, anything that can float is brought into service. The captains of these small boats have heard the thunder of artillery from across the Channel in England, but neither the fear of the big guns nor the omens of disaster could hold them back. It is an all-out English effort. Naval records show that many yachts, although warned that they are too slow, start out against orders and have to be turned back by the Navy. A total of 861 ships and private craft take part in the operation, braving a fierce bombardment by the Luftwaffe. In the air encounters, which take place over the Channel, the Germans lose 130 aircraft, and the RAF 106, with 87 British pilots dead or captured.
By moving over 250,000 troops of all nationalities under close proximity from the Germans, certainly at great cost to both the Navy and the Royal Air Force, was a tremendous feat. The fact that they were assisted by mobilized civilian craft, the legend of the little ships at Dunkirk, in which civilians brought boats out, crossed the Channel to ferry troops from the beaches to warships and transports offshore. This was all part to show the British that the war was a real thing.
With Frenchmen also thronging the beaches, Churchill orders them given an equal opportunity for evacuation. By the 31st of May, 200,000 men have been freed. June 1st, in a last-ditch effort to stop the evacuation, the Germans go all out and throw everything they have at Dunkirk. By the end of the day, 31 ships have been sunk, 11 badly damaged. The Germans are within 4 miles of the beach. But still, the ships come, because there are men yet to be saved. The injured take priority on the ships. Everyone else is crammed onto any part of the boat, except the bridge and the engine room. Some of the men are lucky enough to be fed. For the others, leaving Dunkirk and certain disaster is reward enough. At 11:30 p.m., June 2nd, Dunkirk signals British Expeditionary Force evacuated. At 9 a.m. on the morning of June 3rd, 40,000 remaining troops, mostly French, surrender. The Germans also capture large amounts of abandoned British and French equipment. 2,472 guns, 84,427 vehicles, and 657,000 tons of ammunition and stores.
The evacuation of Dunkirk was one of the great heroic episodes of the Second World War, one of many evacuations. In fact, the British saw this as so much of a success that Churchill had to go on the radio and remind people that wars are not won by evacuations.
Everyone is relieved that from the ruins of Dunkirk, 338,000 men are saved by daring boat owners and are free to fight again. For the people of England, the siege of Dunkirk is at an end. But for the French, the Battle of France is about to begin.